Welcome to TSG Live Model Railroading, a program to share ideas and ask fellow modelers about their approach to the hobby. Sit back, relax, and prepare to be inspired.
All right. Hey, welcome to TSG Live Model Railroading. And thanks to Seth for that great introduction. I'm John, your host, as usual. I want to thank you for joining us here today. We're going to have what I think is a really interesting conversation with a guy named Michael Jordan. Not that Michael Jordan, but a different Michael Jordan. And we're not going to talk about his time with the Chicago Bulls or playing with Scottie Pippen or any of those things, but we will talk about ice reefers, produce shipping from the central coast of California, and how he approaches that on his layout, because it's a really interesting, I think, topic. Let me bring Mike on board here, and I want to continue with our introduction. Hello, Mike. Welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining me here. Just telling the viewers about your operations a little bit. Of course, you can do the deep dive down into the rabbit hole. We'll get to that in a minute. But I just wanted to mention some backstory. So I first met Mike probably around December or January last December or last January. And we did a recording for the Bay Area Layout Design and Operations Weekend, which ended up being a hybrid event. And that's why we recorded. Basically, it was a clinic, right? And I had never seen someone do what Mike does in terms of how he operates the basically, well, it's the operations of shipping produce, right? And other stuff. And it was so in depth that I thought this is a really cool thing that I don't know, Mike, that I don't think most people do what you do in terms of getting really detailed with the procedures and practices of the prototype. So that's really what we're going to be talking about here today. And I'm just really fascinated. So maybe you can tell people a little bit about yourself and how you found this rabbit hole. That would be good. And then we have some notes and pictures and stuff to share. It'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, who knows how these things actually end up, but I lived in the San Luis Obispo area for 20 years and wasn't a rail fan. And it wasn't until I moved to Minnesota that I discovered basements. And so then that gave you a place to do model railroading. And fellow model railroader just said, you should model something And I didn't know anything about the Santa Maria Valley, which then led to me, what does the Santa Maria Valley do? And they do sugar beets, they do general freight, and it's a great produce area. So in the 50s, a lot of produce got shipped out in refrigerator cars, and it was just one of those things that one step leads to the next, and pretty soon you're so far down the path you can't find your way back to reality. So that's kind of how it worked. And it wasn't, I didn't wake up Tuesday and say that I'm going to do refrigerator cars. It was a slow process, and so that rabbit hole gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
Now, the other thing I want to mention is you've gone so far down into this rabbit hole that we're not just talking about how the produce broker orders his cars and puts them in one place to do the icing and the other place to do the cleaning, the other place to do the loading and so on. But we even went as far as to find out what other support materials or commodities are needed to make all this stuff happen. And we were talking on the phone when was that? A couple weeks ago. And I said, Mike,
Yeah.
you'd be a great farmer because you have it all figured out. But
Yeah.
we should probably let some people in on some of this stuff. Is it okay if I bring up the notes and we can go
Sure.
from there?
Yeah, we'll just kind of talk our way through it.
Okay. So first off, you mentioned Santa Maria Valley. Is there anything you want to say about it before I bring up that first slide we have, or do you think that's what you said suffices?
You know, it's odd that, you know, I lived, like I said, for 20 some plus years in San Luis Obispo, and I didn't research Santa Maria Valley until I got to Minnesota. So, you know,
Yeah.
I just think of all the nuggets that I could have found while I was there that, you know.
Well, but you've come back though, haven't you?
I have.
To
I
do some
have.
research.
I have friends and in-laws in California, so I do come out and take pictures and walk around and see what I can find.
I think that's funny. That was the other funny thing that I guess Seth Newman actually found you as a prospective presenter for the SIG meet when he was in Minnesota doing an op session at your layout. And I thought it was funny because you're not the only one. As a matter of fact, the last time we did an episode of live model railroading on a Saturday morning like this, I had Brian Moore from the UK, right?
Yeah.
And he also models the Central Coast. So
Yeah.
it's like the Central Coast must be a very interesting piece of Southern Pacific because Tony Thompson models the Central Coast of California. There are a lot of people that model Central Coast California. So,
Well,
you know,
and I guess you're right. Seth Newman is the one that I guess introduced us because he operated on my railroad and said, well, this is an interesting way to move refrigerator cars. Would you be willing to give a clinic to the Bay Area group? And being polite, I said, sure, I'll do that. And then 2 months later, I get a phone call from Cliff. He's the coordinator for the Bay Area meet. So here I am trying to learn PowerPoint and take pictures and assemble everything. And, you know, on this deadline, you know, just like Jaws, this music in the background continually gets louder and louder. And so,
well, if it's any consolation, Mike, you did a great job, and it turned out, I thought, as a very interesting presentation. So that's why I asked you to come on to the show today, because I'm serious. And I mean it as a compliment. I have not seen someone do that level of prototype, you know, because usually, and I've operated, as a matter of fact, it's another layout that models part of the Central Coast, which is Dave Lovelace's layout here where I live down in Watsonville. I've been operating there fairly regularly for the past few months. And well, let's just put it this way. You have positions where you drop off cart, you know, do your set outs, but it's nothing as specific as put the reefer on the track for icing or cleaning, or, you know, whatever the steps are, which we'll get into this in a minute, for the people watching. It's more like, here, just put it at door 2, or just put it on this track. And then the next time somebody comes into town, it's presumed loaded and they take it away or unloaded, or, you know, whatever the case is. And yours isn't quite that simple. You have a very specific way of doing things that has to go in a certain order. I think we should just get into it, because otherwise I'll be giving all the spoilers away.
Well, before you do, that's how I started. Set out, pick up, hold with refrigerator cars. And then, you start doing a little bit of research, and then, you know, Tony Thompson comes along and he hands me the shovel. He doesn't make me dig the hole, but, you know, you start going. So let's go.
All right. Well, let me bring up the little presentation here. Here we go. This will give people a better idea of what's going on. And just let me know, Mike, whenever you need this advanced. I have the controls right here.
Yeah. Like I mentioned before, just moving to Minnesota and then having a area that I can start a model railroad. And so the house that we purchased had a room 12 by 20, and that was pretty much my room. My wife got the rest of the house, and I got the basement. So
that's why you're still married.
that's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Separate hobbies. Yeah.
I want to interject something just quickly because a lot of people watching aren't from California. So they may not realize most houses in California do not have basements. I think it might have something to do with the sheer number of earthquakes we get out here. So people thinking, well, why did he wait to move to Minnesota before he had a basement? That's why, because
well,
our basements are called garages, and usually people want to park their cars in there.
Yeah,
especially wives.
Yeah, and early on in marriage, you have wives and kids and other obligations. So, the hobby of railroading kind of is percolating in the background. So, but the area of the room kind of dictated that it was going to be a branch line railroad, and you're not going to go from Chicago to Los Angeles in a 12 by 20 room. So, yeah, I think one of the things that is, if you are into operations, is to operate on other people's railroads and learn by their mistakes so that you don't have to repeat them. And so one of the operators, he said that if you're going to design a railroad, pick one And so living in the San Luis Obispo area, I had discovered the Santa Maria Valley Railroad by accident. Literally driving from San Luis Obispo to Santa Barbara, I saw a GE 70 tonner on the tracks, and I'm doing 70. The locomotive's doing 2 miles an hour, so less than 5 seconds was my introduction to the Santa Maria Valley Railroad, and I never followed up on it until I got to Minnesota, and I just remembered that quick thing. So I started doing some research on the Santa Maria, and it worked out really good for a small room. And like everything else, you start out trying to gather every piece of information you can and not realizing if it's viable or not. So
something I've can I ask you a question real
quick?
Because I'm curious about something. I don't know that I've ever actually asked you this about your layout in our numerous conversations, but how prototype is the layout? Like, does it go to all the places where the Santa Maria Valley Railroad went, and are they modeled like pretty faithfully, or is it more of a sort of a proto Lance where you're taking some stuff but leaving a lot of other stuff out, but just to make it operationally interesting?
Well, it's prototypically fictitious. and so, there's an awful lot of discussion about when you are modeling a branch line that, every track or turnout and industry is laid out. But I just use the Santa Maria as a point to gather information about railroading and modified as necessary. For instance, there was a narrow gauge railroad that ran along the coast, and they were in the Santa Maria Valley, and they hauled gravel to different places along the branch line. Well, I put the gravel pit on the Santa Maria Valley, which never serviced it, but it was a nice industry and it generated some traffic. So
Mm-hmm.
I kind of modified as I went, but I'd say most of the industries that are on the railroad were on the railroad, but not. I didn't take a picture of the building and then figure out, to the inch the building. I just built a representation of the building.
Right. What you're describing just to me is someone who likes operations. So,
Yeah,
and it's totally legit. I mean, there are a lot of people who do completely fictitious railroads that have some basis in reality just so that they can do the operational aspects that they enjoy. So, yeah,
yeah,
totally legitimate. I like it.
yeah. And I, I don't know if I've got it on the slide, and I might be out of context here, but if you've got to get your parameters a little bit closer. Otherwise, you just kind of wander off to Never Land. And if you start, you know, picking a error or a year, then that eliminates an awful lot of extraneous locomotives and cars and
Mm-hmm.
industries. So, you just, you know, and you don't start that way, that you end up that way. So
Yeah.
then um, with the Santa Maria Valley, it serviced the agricultural industry. It had a great sugar beet plant, so there was a tremendous amount of sugar beets that came in and processed sugar that left. And the Santa Maria Valley pretty much, the Santa Maria Valley Railroad started to support the oil industry in the 20s. So, it was pretty much the same as what happened to North Dakota is they discovered oil and had to send oil by rail because they didn't have pipelines. Well, that was the
Mm-hmm.
same thing in Santa Maria. They shipped it out on rail until they could get the pipelines built.
Yeah. I think they still ship oil down the coast on the Guadalupe hauler, which is a UP local. At least I'm pretty sure I've seen oil cans on that train before. That might even be the primary commodity that train ships, or that local ships, that job.
Yeah, there used to be a Shell oil refinery someplace on the Central Coast. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
it's still open or not, but I think if you see oil, it's came from there. The Santa Maria doesn't do much oil right now.
Yeah. Well,
All
yeah,
right.
that's
So,
interesting. You said something, Mike, that I want to expand on just slightly, and then we can certainly move on. But you said something about that I think is a worthwhile sort of pro tip, especially for people that are new to model railroading, and that is the idea that picking a region and an era can greatly reduce your temptation for buying stuff that you don't really need for your layout.
yeah.
I think it's a good point. I've had this conversation with other people who do very specific prototype railroading, and that was one of the reasons why. It was like, if you do something that's really broad, you'll find yourself spending a lot of money on rolling stock and other equipment that you don't really, well, need is kind of a funny word. You know what I mean, though?
Yeah.
Because
No.
if
No.
it doesn't belong in the layout, you have an easy out to say, well, I'm not going to buy that schnabel car or whatever
Yeah.
it is,
Well,
as cool as it is, I don't need it. So
but
anyway,
you have to understand model railroaders are part raccoon. If they see something shiny, you know, they they just
yeah.
can't stop themselves.
Well, but if you have a built-in excuse not to buy something, that
Yeah.
that could help a lot,
Yeah.
especially if you have a budget and you're trying to maintain some,
Yeah.
you have to have food in the house.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And, part of that narrowing down your interest, I've operated on railroads that are based around iron ore or coal.
Mhm.
And I thought, God, I've never seen a railroad built around refrigerator car movement. So that's kind of was the other incentive to just be different.
Mm-hmm.
And so and then of course, as soon as I did that, I found a fellow model railroader, Bill Jolitz, who lives 20 minutes from me, who does the same thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So we can go to the next slide.
Oh, okay. Let's bring that one up. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
It's the region.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So just for the audience, the San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara area on the central coast of California, Guadalupe is the interchange point for the Southern Pacific and the Santa Maria Valley Railroad. So it's halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it's basically Central Coast California on the coast. And the Santa Maria, I think at its peak, had 34 miles of mainline track. So it went from Guadalupe to Santa Maria and a little beyond where the oil fields were. So that's the reasoning for the Santa Maria Valley, was the oil fields. And then in the 20s, it went belly up, and then a guy named Alan Hancock bought it. And his family ranch was the La Brea Tar Pits.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so they developed what they called the Miracle Mile, and he did Sherman Oaks and Thousand Oaks. So he had a little bit of cash. And so the Santa Maria was his kind of pet. And he started developing truck gardening and family farms to grow produce rather than just oil.
Yeah. I don't know if a lot of people realize how much agriculture is in this area, even to this day.
Yeah.
In California, I think most people think of the Central Valley or San Joaquin Valley, or, I guess the big valley is considered, or is called the Central Valley. That includes San Joaquin Valley and everything from Bakersfield all the way to like Chico or Redding or something like that. Yeah. I think people think of that as our agricultural center, which it is, but there's a lot of agriculture on the Central Coast that stretches, as you said, all the way from Santa Barbara, really up to Watsonville. It's quite extensive, the agriculture. So that might be, might be why people like to model that area so much.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Even someone from Great Britain.
Yep.
So there's 3 or 4 pictures of the layout, just so people can see the space that I worked in. And in the foreground is Santa Maria, California, and that's the end of the branch. And then you can see that it looks like a wedding cake. The middle level with the Jeeps pulling reefers, that's really an uncoiled helix. So that's just a ramp that gets from the lower level to the upper level. And then at the bottom, there is 2 GE 70 tonners, and they're heading to a packing district, which will pop up here a little bit in one of the pictures. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is just a picture of Guadalupe, and that's the interchange point with the Southern Pacific with the Santa Maria Valley. And you can see in the background a pair of Jeeps pulling some reefer cars, and you can see the ramp system that connects the 2 levels.
It's almost like a switchback, isn't it?
Well, it's more of a crossover. So you come out of east or active staging, and you can either go west or east out of active staging. And then the bunch of cars on the tracks is my staging yard. Rather than pre-staging all the trains, I have a position where the operator or yard master makes up the trains to run on the Southern Pacific up to Guadalupe.
I like the upper fascia. That looks like this daylight colors, or part of the daylight colors. Is that what that was intended to look like?
Exactly. And I didn't know how to get the stripes, you know. So I was in Home Depot and they had electrical tape in different colors, and that orange was almost spot on for the daylight. So
Cool. It looks good.
I just put the tape on it, and boy, it turned out really good.
Yeah, looks really good.
All right, next slide, and we'll. So this is just a representation, like I talked about on the Central Coast. It was really a little bit further south from Guadalupe that the Southern Pacific ran along the coast, but you know, kind of, I painted the backdrop and bought some palm trees just to kind of cement the idea of where I'm at in the real world on my model railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next slide. So part of the thing of working on the railroad, I try to keep it evolving and changing. And I'm at a great spot that I've looked for on the railroad. Is it operates, I've got my industries, but now I'm starting to have time where I can go back and start tweaking some of my buildings. And of course, my modeling skills have improved from when I started until now. So some of the buildings don't, you know, come up to what I want them to be. So
well, it's always something you can improve later, right?
That's correct. Yep. So in reading a book by John Signor, Central Coast, in Salinas, they had all these packing districts, and the railroad gave them names like Tokyo or New York or Chicago. And locals would just go out and switch all these packing sheds in their own little district. And I thought, I could create my own packing district. And I did. I put it on wheels. So when I operate, I can just roll it onto the railroad and plug it in. And then when I'm not operating, it goes back into storage. So this is one of those triggers that really tripped me into the rabbit hole. So we'll go on and see what we can go to the next slide.
I was trying to determine if go on meant go to.
Yeah. All right. So, you know, none of this happened instantly, and none of it had a roadmap. You just kind of go along with it. And so in the Bay Area meet, there was a little presentation that promoted the Bay Area meets. And one of the persons on the dais, I guess, Dave Adams, he made a statement that you don't start something that's very complicated on operations. You know, it's as your railroad matures, you gain knowledge and you start doing research, and then you start trying to replicate these things that you've learned and trying to figure out how to put them on your railroad. And this also goes along with that thing that we were just talking about, is trying to, instead of having these huge parameters, starting to narrow down your interest on the railroad. So, you know, that when I first started with refrigerator cars, it was just, you know, a car card, weigh bill, set out, pick up, hold sequence. And the more I learned about how refrigerator cars were moved, I tried to replicate that on the railroad. So, you know, that leads into doing some research. And so you've got to, in the research, I didn't look for things, but things found me. And, you know, one of the things that I discovered was when cars were sent back east, they would come back west and there would still be ice left in the bunkers, and you know, the 8 boxes of rotten cabbages and whatever was in the cars. So they went to well, for PFE, they went back to a central point where they were cleaned, de-iced, and then were ready for the next demand. And so they would start storing these cars for the next campaign. So that was one thing, that just the car movements before they were needed the next time had to be cleaned and ready for the next shipment. And then I started reading, well, I mentioned Bill Jolitz. He loves to send me information of things I don't know about that will drive me crazy because I'll want to add them to the railroad. And he he doesn't call it cross pollination, but he calls it cross pollution. So that's kind of what we do to each other. And so he started sending me these dry government reports that, there might be 6 people in the whole world that have ever read them. Now there's 7. So,
The real question, though, is whether he actually reads them before he gives them to you, or does he go, "Oh, this looks boring. I think Mike will love this."
I think a combination of both. And now that you mention it, I'm going to have to be more cautious of what I read.
He can hand you anything, and you might find. But something that I want to mention that I think is a key point here is that you're really interested, right? It's not just, oh, well, I can just use this. You want to find out, like, you have a genuine interest in what you're looking at to see how you can apply it to your operations. And I think that's pretty cool. This is one of the things that I think is one of those, I call them facets of model railroading, right? Some people like to build, some people like to operate, some people like to collect, some people like to research. You like to research, and I can tell that you're into it just by the other stuff that you're going to share with us. And it's a totally legitimate way to enjoy the hobby, and the way you've applied it to your layout, I think, is just, I would enjoy operating, I think, on your layout. We'll put it that way, as someone who enjoys operations, because you're not just operating in that case, you're actually learning something about the processes that were employed. And I think that's valuable. It adds a layer of depth that otherwise you might not get. So, well, it's intended as a compliment, Mike. So
yeah, no, thank you. But that's something that we've talked about with fellow modelers, is that the different facets of this hobby is just amazing. You got electronics, you got woodworking, you got model building. Now this with Digitrax, or the running trains with JMRI, which I think JMRI is probably its own hobby now, because I know people that are so deep into that so it's a many faceted thing. And so research is one of those facets. So, and so, like Dave mentioned, that, you don't start with all this detail, but you do end up there if you're into the certain operations. So we can go to the next slide.
All right.
So in the, research and, just general knowledge is that, what crops did they grow in the Santa Maria Valley? And so, of course, it's, the standard lettuce and cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower. But, one of the things is that in the Santa Maria Lompoc area, they grow flowers as a crop. It's cut flowers, some of them. But when we lived in Los Osos, there was a farmer there that grew sweet peas, maybe 200 acres of sweet peas. And then he let them die. And then he's out there with the combine and he's harvesting the seed out of the fields of the sweet peas. And so my poor North Dakota farmer brain just couldn't wrap his head around that you'd use a combine in a field of sweet peas. So it was just, that's the part that is still amazing. So we can go to the next slide. So, and we touched on this earlier about, doing the research of what crops and who did what to whom with the crops. And so I wrote to the Santa Barbara County of Santa Barbara and asked for the crop report for 1955, because that's generally what I model. And when I got the letter back, it said 1956. And then I realized, well, yeah, the 56 report is about the 55 crop. And so that was interesting in what crops were grown in Santa Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the agricultural crops that they shipped was hay. And, I'm sure they didn't put it in a reefer, but, you never thought that they would grow hay and ship it someplace, but they did. And then
I've seen hay on trucks before, but I never knew that they shipped it on trains as well. Is that?
Well, you have to realize this is 1955,
right?
And the infrastructure of roads was not, we didn't even have a freeway system in 55. So,
right.
It was still coastal highways, and it was 101 and 1,
Yeah, they were probably just single lane roads, I'm sure, at the time.
Yeah. And they probably didn't haul it, to New York, but, I'm sure, probably down to Los Angeles to the horse track or something like that.
Sure. Well, cattle ranchers also would use hay. So
yeah,
I'm sure that, and there were cattle ranchers all along the Central Coast as well, not as much as your growing agriculture stuff, but they're still there now. If you take a drive, you'll see the cows out there. So
no. And then this one was the pre-cooling of California grapes and their refrigeration in transit. So this is not something that the general public is going to go, oh, I got to have a copy of that. But it was interesting in that it opened up. This was a study done by the United States government, and they actually had people riding on the trains and stopping and checking the temperature of the different layers of storage boxes for grapes, and were the vents open, were the fans going, did they put salt in the ice? They had all these different parameters of how to make sure that in transit that the grapes were protected. And we'll go to the next slide. And so this is the government report on the protection of rail shipments of fruits and vegetables. So this is like a 271-page report, and each type of crop was listed and how they moved them and how you could protect them. And I don't know if you can make the other half of the slide bigger, but
we're not able to make it bigger, but
okay.
I can just make out Apple's type of car, any load sequence, load ice, add by size, or add dry ice. Oh, someone's calling you about your car warranty.
So in reading this report, I kind of started taking notes, and then I wrote out this chart of, what was the product and what kind of car was shipped in it. And they noticed fan or no fan, and then, uh, you know, the protective service of the shipment. Now, the last column was dry ice. And so some of the product, they would put like 1,200 pounds of dry ice in the car. And that dry ice, when it outgassed, would push oxygen out of the car to prolong the shelf life of the product. Plus, they got cooling out of it. So, this is kind of the nerd level that you end up at to how do you take this information that you got and put it in a usable form? And this was the first step in that usable form. So we can go to the next slide. So this is the start of what I have called the produce broker. There was a produce broker who usually worked with cars in transit, and he would take these independent farmers and try to sell their crop either in transit or even before they left the railroad to get the best price. But he had to work out ways to be introduced to the different growers. So he would make his presentation at Granger associations and different things, and working with the farmers and to make sure that crops were transported. Then he would start working with the railroads and get that relationship. But the railroads had agricultural agents, and they would go out into the field or talk to these Granger associations and see what kind of crops were being grown in certain areas, and when was that crop going to be harvested. And then they would work with the railroad and calculate how many cars they would need. Well, they didn't go to 287 cars. They would say, well, we'll need about 300 cars, and we'll need them in August, and this might be in April. This information would be sent to the central PFE headquarters, and they would start charting out when cars were needed and where. And so they had, fields of clerks that did all this stuff. Well, if you needed 300 cars in August, you're not going to get them all on the 1st of August. It's going to be scattered out from the end of July until the 1st of September. So these cars would be marshaled in, say, Kansas City in June, and then slowly move their way back west. And they would stuff these cars either in San Luis Obispo or Santa Barbara. And then as the produce broker contacted the Southern Pacific agent on daily or weekly needs, then they would start sending cars into the Santa Maria area and storing them in Guadalupe until they actually went out to the packing districts. So this was a process that, was thought out 6 months, sometimes a year in advance, to make sure that there were cars available for the particular harvest. So we can go to the next slide.
Sure. What's really interesting to me, Mike, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about people who maybe see a train, even now, right? They get stopped at the crossing and there's a train going by, and there's all these cars in the train. Although nowadays it's usually just stacked trains, but
Yeah.
but like say there's a manifest train that goes by, and people just think, oh, look, it's a train. They don't think, oh, look, this is an integral part of our transportation infrastructure, and every single car on that train is going somewhere with a purpose. Like there's a reason why they don't just move stuff around for no reason.
Yeah.
And you're talking about that the way you did really sort of exposes this idea of how much planning took place. And it's not just planning by the clerks and the people ordering the cars, but the farmers also had to plan how and when their crops would come in, would be ripe or appropriate to be picked. Do you see what I'm saying? So like, you don't want everything to be ripe all at once because you don't have enough labor to pick, all of your crops all at once. And you wouldn't have the train cars. Even if you had the labor, you wouldn't have all the train cars there all at once because, it takes time to load cars, and some of your fruit or whatever could start going bad before it even gets loaded. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of planning that I don't think people think about that when they think about transportation and infrastructure. So it's another sort of epiphany that you can have when you're talking about stuff like this.
Well, and that kind of leads into when the last time we talked, you had a guest. His first name was Tom, and he talked.
Tom Edwards talked about the STS. I forgot what it was. Simulated. I forgot what it is.
Yeah, I don't remember, but it was how to generate traffic on your model railroad, not by so much the demand of the industry, but how to get cars onto your railroad with purpose rather than just my method, which is willy-nilly.
Right. Well,
yeah.
Is it though? Not really. But
yeah, no.
I understand what you're saying.
But that is what happens on the real railroad. There is a whole division that keeps track of the empties so that if someone asks for a tank car to ship sulfuric acid, they know where an empty car is, and they'll pull it out of the yard and put it on a train so that the local can spot it at the refinery. So, that's part of what happens in the produce transportation is, what is going to be harvested and when is it going to be ripe, and are we going to be able to have enough cars on site? And part of this was in Tony Thompson's book. He talks about if you think of a clockwise motion starting at Texas and going to Arizona and then Southern California, Central California, and then up into Washington, all these crops ripened at a different time during the year so that these cars could be moved to the different areas as they were needed. And, there are certain areas like the Santa Maria Valley that grew, 24/7, but in parts of Arizona, they would have these melon campaigns where there would be this network of track that would sit empty for 10 months. And then the harvest would come, and all these cars and locomotives and people would show up and transport the melons, and then they would move to the next area. So, that was part of that produce brokers requirements. And so the produce broker, he kind of needs to know what kind of crops are going to be grown and when they're going to be harvested. So he can contact the railroad and say, like I said, in August, I'm going to need 271 wood reefers or whatever he needs. And some crops could be shipped in any kind of car, but other crops were dictated by the type of car. And for instance, was that great pre-cooling they wanted more modern cars because in the 50s, they started shipping grapes in cardboard instead of wood. So they couldn't have the load shifting and, all these appendages inside the car ripping the cardboard apart. So the modern cars were smooth on the inside. So they would dictate a more modern car so that waxed cardboard wouldn't rip. And then the produce broker also would dictate to the railroad what protective services that they wanted. And that would be if you're shipping something delicate in August, you'd want to make sure you had enough icing stops in transit to protect your load. And there were all these books that told everybody, what they wanted, and then you could select out of that book of operations. But the produce broker and the farmer would all figure out just what they wanted. And then what I really model is the pre-shipping movements of the refrigerator car. And so which car do you need? How are you going to ice it? Where is it going to be loaded? And after it's loaded, do you want to spend an extra $1 to pre-cool the load before it's sent back east? Or is the product that you put in the car have a shelf life inside the car long enough to actually cool down to a temperature that is convenient for transit? So these are all things that the produce broker would need. And so we can go to the next slide. And so, part of this whole operation of working on a model railroad is, boy, this is a delicate step because, in the real world, there were all these things to deal with. And then how do you just cherry pick, and pardon the pun?
I don't see cherries on the list, do I?
Yeah. You want to kind of figure out what level your model railroad operators are going to be interested in versus, what happens in the real world. So in part of this operation is, we're almost to June, I would say. So if I'm setting up a model operations session, I can refer to this chart, and it tells me what is going to be harvested in the month of June. So this just kind of helps in my process as produce broker. I don't adhere to it 100% because sometimes I'll throw something odd in there just to create more or less work for my operators. But as you can see, the crops that are listed, they're not harvested 24/7, except for maybe carrots, which is another rabbit hole we'll talk about later. But
rabbits like carrots.
There, another pun. Yeah. So we'll go to the next slide. And so with the different crops and the different cars, I just thought I would break it into like 4 different types of cars. And I noticed this when Athearn still made blue box cars. They had these 3 different cars that I noticed. And so one of them was a woodside car, and it's just the texture of the car tells you it's wood. And so I thought I would use these wood cars to ship root crops, potatoes, carrots, rutabagas, onions, anything that grew in the ground would be shipped out in a wood car. And then we'll go to the next slide. So then there's on the left-hand side, you can see a round dot on the car. And so this was, I'm going to say, a little bit more modern car than the wood car. I used to call them steel-sided cars, but then I found out that some of the smooth-sided cars were actually plywood and not steel. So the medallion showed that there was an internal fan for the car, and I decided that I would use those to ship lettuce and broccoli, peas and beans. And then we'll go to the next slide.
This time they're calling about the warranty on your reefer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Quick question, Mike. Do you see at the bottom, Dave Hammer has a question about whether or not you account for indoor or temperature controlled farming. I'm guessing there probably wasn't a whole lot of that going on in the 50s. But
no, there wasn't. In the 50s, it was irrigation and,
right.
You know,
outside fields, right?
Yeah, especially in the Santa Maria Valley, it was, you know, almost perfect temperature year round to grow crops. Just, you know, I don't think it ever really frosted in Santa Maria, and probably never got above 90 degrees unless it was a odd day. So
yeah, one of the benefits of being right by the ocean is exactly that. The ocean really at least at that longitude, I guess it is, really tempers the weather patterns. So
yeah, and if you think of that as a big V that captured that ocean breeze, it just came right up the valley. And
yeah, yep. Even up here, closer, more north, it does the same thing. Watsonville generally doesn't get super duper hot. Salinas Valley doesn't. Well, I guess Salinas gets pretty hot, but being next to the ocean really does cool things down a bit.
Yep.
So.
Yep. So then the next group was a smooth-sided refrigerator car, and you notice there's no medallion. And the difference between a medallion and no medallion is a medallion represented a mechanically driven fan that ran off of one of the axles, and they could make the fan move by hooking up a external motor and pulley system, and then that would spin the fan when the car was stationary. And then the ones without dots, the fans were run off of an alternator. So again, a pulley system from the axle to the alternator created electricity, propelled the fan. So with this, if the car was stationary, you could just plug in the fan and run the internal fans that way. And we'll talk about stationary and fan running when we get to pre-cooling. Then the next one is these are express reefers, and they were used in early harvest when strawberries and berries were at their highest price. They would pay the premium to move these berries in express cars. And then here in the Santa Maria Valley area, they would cut flowers in the evening. One of the local passenger trains would pick them up either in San Luis Obispo or Santa Barbara and move them down to the flower market in Los Angeles. So, again, this is one of those refrigerator crops that you wouldn't think would be, moved by train, but in the 50s, that was the quickest way to get from point A to point B. And they also used express cars for moving medicine and, you know, high value products. But, you know, I just use it for my berries and flowers on my railroad. All right, next slide.
Yep. Something I find interesting, I wanted to mention real quick is, and this is true of a lot of different types of railroad cars. I want to back up for just a second and mention, remember before I was talking about stack trains?
Yep.
I didn't really, just to a common casual observer, you'd see a stack train and say, oh, it's just a bunch of containers. But did you know that there are dozens of different types of containers? I never realized, I think, until seeing your presentation, Mike, how many different types of reefers there really are. I mean, I would just see the yellow PFEs and not even just, oh, it's reefers, but not know, are they the wood-sided reefers? Because you don't pay attention. I never paid attention, but now that I have this information, when I see a reefer block or whatever, I'm going to be interested to find out for my own curiosity, are they mixing these? And does the person running that know what would have been in it? Do you know what I mean? Like there's so much more to it than just, oh, it's an orange reefer, right?
You're talking about model railroading trains.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, this, this is the nemesis that I've brought upon myself.
Right. But it's still interesting though. I mean, I can see why you got into it, because I mean, you're probably an expert now, especially compared to the rest of us when it comes to reefers or shipping produce in the Central Coast. Most people don't know this stuff. I find it very fascinating.
Yeah. And I have to temper the word expert in that I have met experts and my knowledge is, I'm thankful for other people sharing their knowledge so that I can glean these little things that I use for my operation. So, it's.
Yeah. I think expert sometimes is a relative term. A friend of mine used to say, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is the king.
Yes.
Meaning, well, you know what that is, meaning just what you described.
Yeah.
But you know a whole lot more about it than someone like me who could just tell you what a reefer looks like. You know what I mean? So
no,
that's what I mean when I say expert. You're at a level that most people probably don't go that far into that rabbit hole. So.
Yeah, and don't want to. I mean, it all comes down to what I had mentioned before is that, I've operated on ore railroads and coal railroads, and, it's fascinating to see, to me, you take coal out of the mine and then you ship it to the furnace, but then there's all these different steps that, have to be done. And I'd never seen those steps done with a refrigerator car. And so that kind of led that slow research. And, I really have to blame Tony Thompson when he wrote his book, and then I started reading through it, and then you start picking up even more and more knowledge that, he talks about the physical cars and what they did, but my research is that how did they actually get loaded and moved? So
sure. How did they interact with industry, right? I mean, that's
So then,
and on that, it also makes me wonder, because you could look at any type of car or even a truck trailer and know what's in it, but not know all this other stuff. Like you mentioned coal, right?
Yeah.
Oops. How many different types of coal are there? And how there are probably, I don't know this, but I'm just saying that there may be information like, maybe there's a specific hopper or, that they use for coal. You know what I mean? Like, but without knowing, just like there's different types of reefers for different crops.
Yep.
So anyway, someone's asking a question here. Dark cars would be hotter. Why was the Dark Express reefer painted dark? Oh, that's an interesting question.
Well, it was painted dark to match the consist of the passenger train
Right,
because
because those were on the passenger trains. Yeah, the
right.
daylight would
And
have probably taken those.
yeah, and
Hmm.
the Southern Pacific did a study about colors of cars, and they at one point painted passenger train light gray, thinking that that was the color of the dirt, and it wouldn't show up, but it did, and so they found this dark green color to be the best color to not show how dirty the cars were. So,
Hmm.
you know, and uh, he's correct, is that a lighter colored car is the best. And
Mhm.
you'll notice now the cryo cars
They're all white.
and the modern cars, they're all a light color,
Yeah.
and
You know,
the
I
Tropicana cars, I think they're starting to go to a light color with orange lettering. So, they used to be that daylight orange. So,
yeah, I do the product spotlights on contemporary model. Well, really, they're all models of all eras, but and you see them on the railroads too. All of those mechanical reefer, they're all white.
yeah,
I would have thought that they were using the different color also to differentiate between the regular, orange normal priority stuff with the really higher priority freight. You know what I mean? But I didn't realize. But what you're saying sure makes a lot of sense that they wanted those cars not to really stand out because image was a big deal for the railroads at one point,
yep,
where they wanted their passenger train to look like a passenger train and not have a big yellow or bright orange thing in the middle of it. People were like, "What? That doesn't look like a passenger
yeah,
car."
yeah, yeah. I mean, there were the daylight train that ran from San Francisco to Los Angeles. When the train headed north and got to San Luis Obispo, they had a helper engine that was painted the daylight colors, and they'd hook it onto the passenger train and take it up Cuesta Grade so that there wasn't this odd working steam locomotive to interrupt the appearance of their cracked passenger train. I mean, that was at the highlight, but still, you're right. The railroad really wanted that image of, you know, being productive and prosperous.
Sure. So we came back to this crop chart. I'm trying to understand. Was that just
Well,
a reminder of what
um, yeah, this is, if we go to the next slide, and then we can
Oh,
see what I'm just reiterating is that this produce broker, he needs to know all this information, and so crops and what year and all that is part of it. Now, I found this treasure in a flea market here in Minnesota, and it's for the Fruit Growers Express company out of Stanford, Florida. And it I can't model it. I can't use anything for that's information in this book for my modeling operation, but it's so interesting. I just had to include it. So if we go to the next page, this is a log book of every time a refrigerator car came to the ice dock to be iced, they would have to record all this information so that in the protective service, if somebody came back and said my tomatoes were rotten because you didn't ice the car, they had a log book that they could go back to and prove to the shipper that they did everything correctly. And the biggest surprise in this whole book was column 14. And then that is the amount of salt that they would put into refrigerator cars. Well, the salt would lower the temperature of the inside of the car quicker or faster. And it might give you an indication of what was being shipped, because Stanford was known as the breadbasket of celery. So they shipped lots of celery out of Stanford, Florida. So
Huh.
this might be something other than uh, celery that they shipped. But this then adds to that where I'm operating on refrigerator cars. Well, here's something else that I can think about is how much salt did they need at the refrigerator dock?
Oh, so you need to bring salt in, presumably from somewhere in staging, I guess, right?
That's correct. So
Huh.
um, I'll kind of usurp one of my slides, but I think it's a good place to insert it is that again, my fellow modeler, Bill Jolitz, he did a calculation on box shook, the lumber needed to make wood boxes for shipping and for dunnage inside the cars. And he figured that for every 7 to 10 refrigerator car loads of produce required one boxcar of lumber shook.
Oh,
So
so
now,
there's another commodity coming to the
yes, another
layout.
commodity that supports agricultural industry.
So
Correct.
you're not just bringing in empty reefers to be loaded. You're bringing in boxcars of shook and well, I don't know what salt would have been hauled in. Probably some kind of a hopper, I would imagine.
Not in the 50s. I'm sure it was in bags and box
Oh, in
cars.
boxcars, yeah.
Yep.
Huh.
Because,
That would be my second guess.
yeah, well, and they might haul it bulk in a box car too.
Just
'Cause
shovel it in.
yeah, because they
Yeah.
did that with sugar.
Sure.
But, um, there is a picture of a salt bunker underneath an ice dock in Tony's book. And, that was kind of a background picture. So then, again, my brain went to it and said, okay, who's the poor guy that's standing in a box car of salt all day long, shoveling salt out of a car and into a bunker? So,
Yeah, no wonder he's so salty.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I wonder,
And,
I wonder if I can make something up here. I wonder if that's where that term came from. People say that, oh, he's salty. Probably because
yeah,
the guy in the salt car shoveling salt all day was
yeah.
not in
I,
a
th-
very
I
good
think
mood.
I think it's a naval term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just making stuff up here,
Yeah.
John's
Well,
linguistics class,
yeah, that's how I do it. Well,
word etymology.
yeah. Well, I made things up until Tony came to my railroad. So
Oh, right. Well, like I said, the one-eyed man, right?
that's right. Yeah. So I got to interject this because it's just so classic. Uh, fellow modeler here in town, he models the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Tony Thompson went over and operated on his railroad. So on his railroad, Greg has 2 refrigerator cars that say Southern Pacific, not PFE, but Southern Pacific. And, we've operated on his railroad and Tony turns to Greg and says, well, those cars would never make it to the Pennsylvania Railroad because they were in captive service. No produce would be shipped in a Southern Pacific refrigerator car. They were used inter-railroad to ship ice from a warehouse to a depot or a caboose track, or they're used inter-service for delivery of ice to the railroad. And so I'm thinking, there's one person in the world that knows that fact and was able to observe it and tell poor Greg that, and he was just tickled pink that he had 2 refrigerator cars on his railroad, not knowing this fact. So, that's the fun part of model railroading too.
Yeah. As long as the person telling you that you did something wrong is nice about it. And I'm sure Tony was very diplomatic.
I'm positive, but
Yeah.
these are little nuggets that, no one else could use. But to me, that was like, thumbs up. That's a great little nugget of information. I didn't even think that Southern Pacific had refrigerator cars. I thought they were all PFE. So now, guess who's going to be making a Southern Pacific refrigerator car for his railroad?
Well, you got to bring the ice in somehow.
Yeah, no, really, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, PFE did have ice service cars, but that was really for inner PFE use and not, general freight. But I want to point out in the ticket punch that keeps the book open, and we'll talk about ticket punches and how I use them later on. But it's again another little thing. So let's go to the next slide. All right. So all this information that you gather is, you gather it and you figure out how can I use it in my operation and why is it necessary? So besides just marshaling the huge amount of refrigerator cars, let's say in Kansas City and then Los Angeles and then say Taylor Yard up in San Francisco. So, the refrigerator cars had many movements to them that were necessary, I guess. And so depending on what you were harvesting and what time of the year it was, you could fill the ice bunkers up with ice before they were loaded, and that would be for delicate crops that couldn't take heat. And then cars could be loaded and then iced. Let's say sun-kissed oranges, they had huge cool rooms that the load would be chilled, so they could be loaded and then iced. And then there are other products that would be loaded into the car, and then the load would be pre-cooled before it was shipped. And this was a delicate balance of what's the shelf life of the product, how quickly can they retard the field heat to extend the shelf life, and or they got charged every time a refrigerator car was iced in transit. So if you could eliminate 2 ice stations on your transit, you might save, I don't know, let's say you save $20, but it cost you $15 to pre-cool the car. You save $5. And you say, well, big deal. But if you're a big grower or a growing association and you save $5 and you ship 10,000 cars, you saved $50,000 per year. So these were, the delicate balance that the produce broker would have to figure out what's the best way to go. And then after a car was pre-cooled, then they'd have to top ice the car. So now here's another movement that you'd have to do. So you ice the car, you loaded it, now you pre-cooled it, and now you got to move it back to the ice dock. Well, there's 4 different movements of that car before it even put onto a train that would send it back east. So top icing was another thing that could happen either at the dock door or move to a specialty track. And that usually is like a rip track. And there would be a truck that had to have a trailer full of ice and then this great big snow cone machine that would chop up the ice and blow this shaved ice all over the load. And that introduced humidity to the car, so lettuce and celery wouldn't dry up. Plus it added more cooling. And then this is number 6 was one of those things that I was informed that would hardly ever happen because PFE was very, very strict about making sure that cars that they delivered to their clients were, one, clean, and two, not infested. But I was given a pass on that, in that it was an interesting movement that you could add to the whole thing. And then gassing, sometimes they would, if you're shipping especially melons, they would put an inert gas into the car just to push out the oxygen. And then, of course, dry ice, let's say strawberries were being shipped, that would push out the oxygen plus give you some additional cooling. And then, like any other railroad car, you could make a movement to get the car repaired.
Oh, someone was asking about sugar earlier, about whether sugar being hauled in boxcars would have to stay on the move to prevent ants from finding it. I don't know if they were being serious or not, but
Well,
I've
no,
never really thought about that before.
yeah. Well, this is one of those, in the 50s, this is that transition time period where everything was put into a boxcar. I mean, the Great Northern shipped coal in boxcars because they didn't want the weather freezing the coal into one giant lump. So they would put it in a boxcar instead, because covered hoppers weren't part of the deal then. So, grain was shipped in boxcars. And so there are cars that are available that say sugar loading only, and they ship bulk sugar in boxcars. Same way they did with cement in the 50s. There were boxcars. So,
Yeah.
I don't know how they kept the insects out of sugar. I mean, you'd think that would be a huge draw.
Mm-hmm.
So then all these things that I've been talking about is the crop chart kind of tells you what load that we're going to have, and then the packing plant that would actually load the car would have to be determined by the produce broker. And there'll be a picture on how I kind of figure out where these cars are spotted and how they're going to be spotted. But the idea is that, and I wish I could figure out when I came up with this single use car card versus I used to, all my refrigerator cars had car cards, and then it had a way bill and you'd slip it in. And like I said, it would be the, set out, hold, pickup combination. But as I learned all these different nuances to the refrigerator car movements, I couldn't, how do you keep track of how you're going to move this car through the prototypical sequences or modeled sequences? So I came up with this with this card, single-use waybill, and I did exchange emails with Tony Thompson through his blog, and I sent him this card, and he says, "Well, it's not a waybill; it's more like a work card." So I have to give Tony the credit due here for coming up with the work card name, I guess. So I created this card just to keep track of how I'm going to put this particular car through its different paces. So we have the car number, the spot and load that the produce broker writes in where it's going to be spotted and what's going to be shipped, and then determines which type of car is going to be needed for that particular product. And when we went through the sequence of the cars, it showed what was going to be shipped in which car. So potatoes would be in a wood-sided car. And instead of using a check mark, I use my ticket punch and punch that column on the far right side that says wood. And then the handling sequence is, again, the produce broker figures out what that sequence is by what is being shipped, what time of the year that it's going to be shipped, and the distance it's going to be shipped. So I feel sorry for the housewife in Boston that's going to get a head of lettuce because, lettuce has a shelf life of about 10 days, and it took 10 days to get from California to Boston. So she had a couple hours to buy that head of lettuce and get it home.
Yeah, got to eat that salad real fast.
That's it. Yeah. And then, at the very bottom, I say I don't model the vents if they're open or closed or salt. My fingers are too big and the hatches are too small. But that salt thing, just as you can tell, just kind of flabbergasted me for another part of this refrigerator operation I didn't know about that now I'm going to have to figure out how to interject it. So we can go the next.
I think bringing the salt in just on its own is a sufficient, right? I mean, it adds another level of realism that wouldn't be there even if you were just doing what I was suggesting earlier, which was to just bring the reefer into an empty track and say, okay, it's loaded now, properly. So please proceed, sir. It's getting deep now.
I do have in the town of Santa Maria a salt house. And so I do bring in box cars of salt, and they go to the salt house and then emptied and then sent on their way. So now we're back to the module that I created that's a packing district. And
there's that punch again.
Then there's that punch again. Yeah. So to determine, what I'm going to move, I look at my layout and specifically this packing district and start. I just put cards at empty doors, and so I've got a spot that can be filled, so to speak. And then I go, okay, I got on the upper left is Swanson potatoes. So I'm going to be shipping, carrots or potatoes or rutabagas. And then in the center is Western Packing. It's an independent packing house, so it can ship just anything. So I got two openings. And then on the far right is Pacific Packing, which ships citrus, so oranges, grapefruits, lemons. And then on I don't have anything at Bonita, but that kind of determines what's going to be shipped. And then if I'm operating in the month of June, then I get the crop chart out and figure out what crops I can interject into my cards. So we can go to the next slide.
Can I say too, Mike, that's something I think is pretty cool, because you can do that to vary your op sessions for guys, especially if you have a regular operating crew. It's like, oh, we're doing something different this time because, potatoes are out of season. So
that's correct.
Right. So now we're going to do tomatoes this month, whatever the case is. I think that's really a cool touch that it's what's the word? It's like a level of function that a lot of people I don't think would build into their operating scheme, but because you have the information, it's just, I think it's really, I'm fascinated by this, in case you couldn't tell. This is really cool.
Yeah. Well, again, I have to go back to reading Tony Thompson's book, and he had a kind of a generic crop chart, and then I went through the book and gleaned what was in the book, what was going to be harvested in the Central Coast, and then I got the crop report from the county of Santa Barbara, where Santa Maria is, and then Bill Jolett's sending me these government reports that all that stuff is things that are thrown into the hopper, and then if you think of this as a big funnel, you throw everything in the funnel, and then hopefully the good stuff comes out the narrow end, because you've called out these extraneous things. So
I think the way you've applied the information to the operating scheme is just brilliant.
Thank you. So now we go to the next slide, and so I had the cards leaned up against the different areas, and so now I take a look at my crop chart, and I'm going to be shipping potatoes, tomatoes, broccoli, spinach. And then if you notice the center where I punched, I've got, I need a car with a dot. I need a wood-sided car because I'm shipping tomatoes, and then a no dot car for shipping fruit because tomatoes are technically a fruit, and then broccoli, which is a dot car, and again, it's produce. And then the sequence of what movements the car is going to go through. This is just me as the produce broker looking at the product and trying to make an interesting sequence of car movements. And so spinach has got 5, potatoes just 2. I mean, you're going to load them and ship them. I mean, and if it's August, the problem with potatoes is they create internal heat. And so if you just leave them alone, they'll get hot. So they do take quite a bit of ice just to maintain their non-decomposition temperature. And so then
here's an interesting question. I believe you're going to talk about this later, but I think this is a great question. He wants to know why the car number is not on there. So should we wait until you talk about that, or do you want to tell him now?
No, I think, Robert, I'm going to send you a gold star and a donut with sprinkles on it. That's just a great question, and if you just hang on a bit, we'll get to the no car number.
Yeah, you can tell Robert's a bit of an operations geek to even have that question, and
yeah,
he is. I know who that is. So.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's a great question.
It is. All right. Next slide. All right. So the produce broker, he knows what he's going to ship now, and so he tells the yard master where the local refrigerator cars are marshaled that for today's packing district, he needs 1 wood-sided car, 2 without no dot, and then he's going to need 1 dot car. So I screwed this up. It goes 1, 2, 3, but
I think I screwed it up, Mike, when I made the adjustments to it. I thought that was a typo, so I apologize. So that should read 1 wood-sided. I thought it was a list. That should read 1 wood-sided car, 2 no dot cars, and 1 dot car. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Because the yard master, he doesn't care about the car number. The produce broker just says, I need these cars, these types of cars, because I'm shipping product that requires those type of cars. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. So here you can just see that, we've got reefers in the yard, and like I said, the yard master is told by the produce broker the types of cars he needs, and so we'll go to the next one. So here the yard master, he's pulled the appropriate cars, and he's going to move them over to the departure track for the packing district. So we'll go to the next slide. And here you can see the first shift for the packing district is heading off to the packing plant or produce yard. And so the Santa Maria Valley was kind of known for its GE 70 tonners, and they had 10 of them. And so it was an interesting railroad that they figured out that these little GE 70 tonners worked for them. All right, next slide. All right, so now here's the sequence of events of what we're working with. And so the Bonita Packing is going to ship some spinach. And so they need a produce car, which just randomly I said that these dotted cars would ship produce just to add interesting to the operating session. And so here you can see again the ticket punch. The first thing to do is to clean the inside of the car. And I have a little rip track, and then you can see the sign that says the clean out. So we're moving the car to the clean out track. And now the sequence is kept track of, not by a check mark, but with a hole punch. And I tried to get rid of this hole punch sequence, but my operators really like that tactile feel of punching rather than using a check mark or a pencil. And I use cardstock. So there is a satisfying click when you keep track of these different things.
Yeah,
now,
it really makes the process complete, doesn't it?
Oh,
You're
yes.
punching it out. There's something very final about punching something out like that. I think it's a nice touch.
And I originally just went to the hobby store and got some punches. But when I was at a flea market, I saw this gentleman selling hole punches. So I said, for $10, I think I'll buy a hole punch. And so every time I go to the flea market, I find another hole punch, and
now all the people watching there's going to be a big run on hole punches at flea markets, and all the flea market guys are going to wonder what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
So and our friend Late Night Model Railroad wants to know how often you have to sweep the floors to get all the hole punches going.
Yeah. Well, everybody's worried about when they punch the hole, is I tend to vacuum the layout room before every session, so I get rid of the debris that way. So I just tell them, punch it, let it fall to the floor, and we'll vacuum them up later. And so the railroad punches had all different kinds of patterns to them, and I think that the conductors, would sign out for a hole punch so they knew who punched what hole and if they were actually working. So,
here's a pro tip also. It doesn't have to be a conductor's fancy shaped punch. If you want to apply something like this on your own operations, you could just use a regular circuit or hole punch. It'll still give you that tactile stimulation, and it will still complete the process. So I think having a railroad punch like this adds to the feeling of being, working on a railroad, but it's not necessarily,
No,
Well,
I when I first started, I just, like I said, I went to the hobby store and bought hole punches, and it was just that I was at the flea market and saw a railroad punch, and I went, "Holy smolies,
yeah,
let's buy a bunch of them." So
yeah, that's more appropriate. It's more in context, right? It's
yeah,
cool. It's a
yeah.
great touch.
All right, so we'll go to the next slide, and then this will answer the question.
Hey, hey.
There is the card number. So the Bonita Packing, he doesn't care about the car number. He is just worried that he's going to get the right type of car. So when the train crew comes down to the packing district, they've got a string of cars. They know Bonita needs a dotted car, so they pull a dotted car out of their string. And when they spot the car, the correct type of car at Bonita Packing, then the train crew writes in the car number that they spotted. So you could come down with 4 of the same type of cars going to 4 different industries, and the packing plant doesn't care about the number. But to keep track of the sequence, now you write in the car number, and you can keep track of that particular car as it moves through the sequences. And again, it's moving to the ice dock. After it's been cleaned, it's moving to the ice dock, and now we got the punch out again. We're going to punch number 2. And I hope that answers the question why there wasn't a car number, because it just
Not only, yeah,
gives
not
the
only does it answer the question, but it makes a lot of sense too, because the people ordering the cars have no idea what the car. They're not going to order that specific number. They
no,
don't care.
yeah, no, and
Yeah,
it creates more interaction with the train crew, with the operation as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. That's another one of those things that a lot of people just compress out. They tell you which car, and that's the one you get. Well, in this case, what you're doing is you're really, do you know what it is, Mike? You're telling the story, and this type of interaction, as far as I'm concerned, creates buy-in by the operators. They're like, oh yes, I really did do this in the central coast of California when I was at Mike's op session. So I think it's a brilliant little detail to include.
yeah, no, yeah.
Oh, we have another fan.
Yeah, so let's go to the next step here. And so now we're, step 3. And so we're just, the car's being loaded. So now we'll go to step 4. So now pre-cooling, this is another one of those, the little rip track has a pre-cooling sign that's hard to read. But again, this is a dotted car. So it has an internal pulley system that mechanically drives the speed of the fan. Well, to pre-cool the load as it's stationary, they would disengage the pulley system that's internal to the car with a lever, and then they would hang an electric motor onto the car, hook it up to an external pulley system, and then that electric motor would spin the fan inside the car to circulate the air. So the more air circulation, the quicker that load is going to get down to a predetermined temperature. Now, they also had pre-cooling plants where they'd actually run the car into these plants, and then they'd have these things that look like slinkies that were covered in canvas, and they would poke those into the ice dock hatches, and then pump cold air into the refrigerator car. And then they'd open up the car doors, and they would have this canvas door system that the air would circulate into and then back to the cooling plant. That way they didn't have to cool air that was 90 degrees down to 40. They would cool air that was at 70 down to 40. so they could reuse that cooler air.
Hmm.
So that was the other method of pre-cooling. But you can see now with, you know, we're just going through this sequence. Each one of these sequences, other than icing, would be a half shift or a full shift determined by the produce broker. So then we'll go to the next slide. So then here we are. After it was pre-cooled, it would melt quite a bit of the ice inside the car. And so it'd have to be re-iced. And now the car is ready for transport to its final destination. And this is where it would go from being a work card to a way bill that could send this out. And I don't model that way bill part. So once this goes through this total sequence of events, which would be maybe 3 or 4 operating sessions, then the cars are moved back to active staging, and then they're ready for the next assignment. So we can
So
go to,
I'm going to advance it, but I do have a question.
yep.
That I'm just getting this now, this epiphany that module you made is kind of separate off the layout. And now this is the second or third time I've seen this, and I'm finally picking this up. So you have an operator working just the work jobs with work cards for an op session, just on that module. And then when he's done, he puts it on a specific track, and then you take that car physically and move it over to the staging on the main layout. Is that correct?
No, when the locomotive or the crew is done with their car movements on the packing district, they take those cars that have gone through their total sequence and they trundle them back with the locomotive and the caboose back to active staging.
Oh, so the module is connected to the overall layout.
That's
okay.
correct.
I wasn't sure I understood that before. And I'm just trying to get a picture of what this looks like in action. Okay.
Yeah. It's the module's on wheels. And so I roll it into the laundry room, and then I have a short piece of track that I use to connect it to the layout, similar to a modular, group with their different modules. So
yeah, I got it.
Yeah,
but I mean, I guess really the point to my question is it could be done as on a separate module, maybe off in a different room or something, and then when the cars are done, they could just 050 switch them onto the main layout. So
that's possible. Yes. But I connect it physically so that it is part of the layout during operations.
Yeah. And I think some people do that with car floats too, when they model car float ops.
Yeah.
So sorry, please proceed. I just wanted to get a clarification for my own satisfaction.
Well, and then this is one of those things I'm going to do down the road is that I'm going to create this module as a standalone module with its own staging, and it can just be that module that you bring in cars and just move the cars on the module. So if someone lives in an apartment, they can operate. And
that could be a great operating scheme for a micro layout.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so the thing is that we brought 4 cars down from active staging to switch out. But as you can see, I've got 7 more cars that were on that module that needs to be moved to the next sequence. So you're not only just moving the cars you bring in, you're also going to have to figure out how to move the cars that are already there in their sequence.
So luckily that it tells you right on there. So if I'm operating on your layout and I'm looking at that top left car for lettuce, I know that it's been loaded, and I know that I need to move it to the ice dock next because number 2 is the icing. So this is cool because it's like a switch list without using a switch list. You just go for each card. It's an ingenious way, I think, of directing car movements.
Yeah. And then in the upper right-hand corner, there is a refrigerator car that does have a car card waybill, but those are ice service cars. So this module has an ice plant, but it doesn't manufacture ice. So on a daily basis, they have to bring a carload of ice to the ice dock for the day's operation. So there's one more refrigerator car movement that takes place on the module. So, and then we'll go to the next slide. These are things that, you just, like you were mentioning, that support the refrigerator operation, is other things that are shipped in refrigerator cars. So if you're not in a packing plant or ship produce and you just have a model railroad, all kinds of things are shipped in refrigerator cars. And one of the interesting things was wax paper that in the summertime, when they were shipping wax paper to the deep south, they would use a refrigerator car because the car would get so hot that it'd melt the wax and, just have this big gooey mess in your railroad car. So, who would have thought that, and of course, medicine, candy, chocolate,
Sure.
So then, doing this whole research is, all the support stuff that you also can model, you got fuel and soil conditioners, fertilizer, So again, that just creates more switch movements. And my railroad is, I'd say 50% general freight and 50% refrigerator cars. And what I haven't done, but I want to do, is have a weekend of operating sessions that is nothing but campaign of refrigerator car movement. So Saturday morning, one group would come in, Saturday afternoon, and Saturday evening. And all we would do is move refrigerator cars all day long, just as a campaign for moving produce.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, one of these rabbit holes is carrots. Again, just gleamed onto this one thing. And I'm going to blame Brian Moore for this. He lives in England, but he's caused me heartburn. He told Tony Thompson, and Tony Thompson told me that there was this place called Raymar Carrots in Guadalupe, and it shipped 2 refrigerator cars a day of carrots every day, 6 days a week. So I thought, well, that's a lot of carrots. And so then I started doing the math. How many carrots are in a car? How many carrots grow per acre? And it comes out to 1.8 acres to grow enough carrots to load 2 refrigerator cars a day. The growing season for carrots is 70 to 90 days. So then you can't plant 100 acres of carrots all at once. You've got to plant them every other day, or every day you got to plant 2 acres of carrots. So it takes 100 acres of land to have a sequence of events of harvest time to fill 2 refrigerator cars. So you just, then you say, okay, it takes how many pounds of carrot seed to,
Right.
So now you got this other sequence of who grows carrots And where do they grow carrots? Just for the seed, you know?
Yeah. And how does that get taken to the farmers? I mean,
Yeah.
they,
And,
they harvest their own seeds. I mean, there's all these questions, and you know, you have this. I'm going to say this in a good way. You have this level of, I'd like to call it OCD. Maybe that's not what it is, but you're very focused on following the process to the end,
yeah,
and it's very satisfying when you reach the end, isn't it?
it is. It is. And, it again, I have to go back to Dave. I didn't start that way, but that's where I ended. All this information is great, but if you can't convert it to where your operators can do the sequence of events and enjoy it, because
Right.
I've been on railroads where it turns into drudgery. So you just got to make sure that what you do is exciting. And the packing district is very concentrated on refrigerator car movements. The other towns, I do move produce in the other towns, but it's not as concentrated as it is on that packing plant. But I've got a core group of operators that fight to do the produce packing district. So
yeah, someone's commenting on here, and I think they're echoing what I just said, that they like how you've thought the whole process through, and it's inspiring him to really think about what he's going to do with his layout. And this is one reason why I really enjoy doing shows like this, because I think what you've done is inspirational. And if it gets someone else to think about stuff and research stuff, well, I mean, we grow when we learn. So that's a good thing.
Well, the last time I was on, I kind of chastised Jack Burgess for, modeling August 7th at 2:00 in 1939, but the benefit that he brought to model railroading is that he set up certain parameters that if you focus to that parameter, you can learn much more about model railroading operations rather than just, I'm going to run trains from Chicago to Los Angeles and I don't care what kind of car it is. I'm just,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And if you think about it that way, that I think wasn't really something that people did as far down the rabbit hole as he went. And in a way,
I think he was one of the first to do it.
Yeah, I think in a way he influenced where model railroading went by doing that. And I think it's cool. And, as you know, I do a regular series with him, and the guy's methodology is very satisfying to me, because there's a reason for everything on the railroad, and it's because the prototype did it. But as you also know, and I think probably most people watching also know, he wrote the book about the YV. And in order to write the book, he had to do all that research to find out what exactly they did so that he could tell their story.
Yeah.
So it kind of, I think that the layout and the book fed into each other, a level of realism that otherwise may not. I mean, someone would have eventually done it, I think, but who knows when.
Yeah. And I think this is the other thing too, that is in operations there. It's really a subset of model railroaders. And,
sure.
You want to keep your model railroaders occupied and let them have fun. And operators like to share their knowledge. And I think that's a great aspect of the hobby that, we didn't touch on earlier. We touched about the facets of the hobby is, woodworking and artistry and all that. But the other facet is just the companionship of other railroaders. So
yeah, there's definitely a social aspect that I think a lot of people don't. I think they kind of miss, like they kind of whiff on that. And to be honest, look, the op sessions that I go to, they're an excuse to go hang out with friends. I mean, I do the same thing applies with prototype rail fanning. I mean, we go out to trackside, and I don't think any of us really cares that much what trains we see. We're hanging out with our buddies, and it's kind of an excuse to hang out, right? So there's definitely that social aspect.
Yeah, exactly. I'm part of a podcast locally.
Oh, yeah, we should talk about that for a second.
Twin City Division podcast, and it's moderated by Ken Ziska and Tom Gazer. And it's a we do it because we like to hang out. And
it shows too when you're listening to it.
Oh, thank you. And, since you and I have been introduced electronically, I've been turning on your show in the background when I'm doing my office work. And, I have to say, you've caused me some great angst because I end up watching the show instead of doing the work. So
I've posted a link in our text chat to the Crossing Gate. This is the podcast that Mike is mentioning just for the viewers. It says that we have one more slide to go to. Should I advance that and then we
can? It's just it's the bibliography of some of the stuff, and
people might be interested in that.
Yeah,
and further reading or whatever.
Yeah, and I just want to mention the very last one I just discovered. It's a Santa Fe promotional video of produce, and it touched on the produce broker and the railroad agent and the large agricultural support service that these railroads had in the 50s that are long gone. But and of course they show in the Santa Fe video of these massive earth moving machines destroying the landscape to make it agricultural productive so that the railroad can ship product. So it's not a politically correct.
Well, right. But I mean, clear cut logging isn't either, but it happened. So I mean, this is historical stuff. And I'd like to close the presentation part. And I looked at the clock and realized that we've gone our allotted time, but I wanted, if you have time, Mike, I want to open this up in case anybody has questions.
Sure.
People have been asking questions as we've gone along, but sometimes people hold their questions until the end. So if you have another 5 or 10 minutes to hang out here.
I do.
Okay, then we can, I'll call now for questions. If you have any specific questions about what we've been talking about, or even just comments about ops or whatever, you're welcome to put them in the chat now, everybody watching. And also I want to mention that in case people don't know, hold on a second, can the link to the YouTube, Joey, are you talking about the Santa Fe video?
I think so.
I think that's what he's talking about. That didn't look like to me, that didn't look like hold on, let me see if I'm going to bring it back up real quick. Yeah, that doesn't look like a YouTube link. It's https mail.google something.
Oh.
So I'm guessing that if you go on YouTube and search for Santa Fe produce operations or something like that, you'll probably find it. So, but I think that's a cool thing. Santa Fe had a lot of training videos back in the day that give you a glimpse into some of their operations too, their prototype operations that I think is if you can find them, and a lot of people have posted this stuff on YouTube. I guess that must not be copyrighted anymore, or maybe they just don't. Well, I mean, Santa Fe doesn't really exist. BNSF is kind of, but I guess they must not care if people repost old Santa Fe training videos. I don't think they're giving away any secrets. I mean, a lot of the operations that they used to do don't even exist anymore. So it probably doesn't give any bad people insight on how to sabotage things or anything like that. So they must not care.
Well, afterwards, I'll see if I can dig it up, and then I'll email the link to you, and then you can.
Oh, okay. So anybody who's watching this on the replay, look in the video description below. And as soon as I have the link from Mike, I'll post that too. I'll update the description to include that information. Looks like we found one, or I should say the top secret producer over here sitting next to me found one. I can't click on that, so people will have to look at that when we're done here. It's in the text chat now. But anyway, if anybody has more questions about Mike's operations, I really do think, Mike, that you've taken this to a level that, well, let me put it this way. If I had just a small space that I had to model in, I would look at doing something like this, because I think it's just an ingenious way to make something interesting, because just your produce broker module alone is an entire position for an op session. And I'm always, well, I mean, if you think about it, also a lot of your inspiration came from Tony Thompson, and he also has physically a small layout that he's just jam-packed all kinds of operations into. Just for the viewers, we were chatting about this off camera, before we started. And I was telling Mike how, because I did a video layout tour of Tony Thompson's Santa Rosalia branch. It's a fictitious, it's like a proto lance, right? He's modeling Southern Pacific very faithfully, but on a fictitious setting. And I tell you what, when I walked into the room where the layout is, I was kind of surprised at how small the room was. And then I was surprised again by how much operational interest he has on this layout. And the really interesting part to me about it is that it's all on one side. Of almost all the interesting operations stuff is on only half of that small layout on one side of the room. And it was just really fascinating to me how he was able to fit so much into such a small space. And if you haven't seen that video layout tour, you got to watch it just to see how many industries he has on that one side of the layout. It's really remarkable. So I hope someday, Mike, to get out to your area so that I could see your layout and really see it in person to catch, the full picture, maybe operate on it. I don't know. I mean, if that's,
if you ever have a reason to come to Minnesota, and just give me a call and we'll set up an operation.
Sure. One thing I know is it won't be in the winter.
No.
Because I don't like cold stuff.
Yeah, I often wonder about mid-January what brought me here.
I wonder what brought you there too, but I'm also California native. I've been here my whole life. So I always call, when it comes to weather, I call myself a California wimp, because anything under about 60 degrees is cold to me.
Yeah.
Anything under 60 degrees is, better get the jackets out, Maybe if it's under 50 degrees, then you need the gloves or those little ear warmer things.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing a lot of other questions coming in on the text chat. It looks like it's mostly comments. But
I do have one quick little story. Is
oh yeah, please.
We do MinRail here every 2 years, so we invite people to the Twin Cities to operate on our railroads. And so one MinRail retired Milwaukee conductor did my produce plant, and he concentrated pretty hard. So after the session, I asked him, I says, "Did you have fun?" And he says, "Well, it was very prototypical." And I said, "Well, did you have fun?" And he says, well, it was very prototypical. So I took that as a compliment. So.
Okay. I was going to ask you what was the real message in that? Because if it were me, I already know I would have had fun. I like it though. I think that's down to a level, as I've told you, off camera before, down to a level that I haven't experienced. I haven't operated a whole hell of a lot of layouts, but I've operated enough to know that most people don't really think to get into the weeds that far. So,
well, I didn't start there.
I know, but
I
I'm
ended
glad
up
you
there.
did it. Yeah. Here's something that I think is a good question. This is kind of a generic question, but I think it's a legit question. What if you had to start over? What would you do differently, if anything?
I'd probably just make it bigger and probably be more accurate in the industries on the railroad and the packing district. I'd still have the packing district because it just kind of stands out as something that people like to do, and not everybody likes to do it. So, the majority of the railroad would be just your standard set out, pick up, and hold kind of operation. But I think one of the things I'd do is probably have a marshaling yard for the loaded cars before they moved off the railroad. Because if the cars sat too long, you'd have to re-ice them. So you'd have to keep track of those cars and their time of being stationary and getting them re-iced. So
you could build that into your op session scheme as well.
yeah,
As someone, as a yard master working at that yard, to send some of them back to the ice dock. That could be
that's correct.
interesting.
That's
Yeah.
correct. Yeah. And a lot of these cars were loaded and might be a day before they get to the ice dock. So,
Yeah.
you know,
He's making a suggestion that you could do another module and make it your marshaling yard. That's an interesting idea.
that's funny. I had thought about that. I didn't operate. I'm sorry. I've had people who have operated on a railroad. A guy named Clyde Fazenbaker, who is long past, but he had a produce area and a marshaling yard, and that's what he did. Is you had to keep track of your cars in the marshaling yard,
Mm-hmm.
and if they sat too long, you had to move them back to the ice dock. And
Yeah.
I could make a secondary module that these two could plug into each other, and you know it. It's that apartment thought process of not having a layout and how you can still enjoy the hobby.
I think the apartment thought process is real too. I mean, especially for people where I live, where apartments are very, very expensive. I think people who are into model railroading are doing stuff like modules for that reason. So,
Yeah.
Bernard is curious whether or not you would do a helix.
Nope.
Yeah, I know
Friends don't let friends do helixes.
Yeah, helixes are one of those sort of controversial things, and I understand now. I understand why people don't like helixes because your train's off the layout, you can't see it. It totally suspends belief, for that you're somewhere. But I also understand in some cases, I've seen a helix used in a way that really maximized the functionality of the space. So it's one of those very useful tools that I think my personal approach to a helix would be only build one if you really must have it to accomplish what you're trying to do, because they're a pain in the ass to build. There's a lot of negatives to them, right? And I don't know.
I have seen helixes done quite well, and just in the recent Klonbach planning, they showed where the helix is exposed, not at every level, but they bring the train into the scene with a bridge or a tunnel entrance or little vignette. And I worked with a gentleman, Randy Nord, and he had a helix, but it was also where the dispatcher sat.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of layouts where the dispatcher is inside the helix.
You could rail fan and dispatch, and he had in his helix, he had a couple hard meets where trains would go into a siding and then another one would pass. And there was a gentleman that did N scale, and his dispatcher was on the inside of his helix, but he scenic the inside. So, it wasn't as bad as you thought. But yeah, I guess you can get away with it, but it's just the maintenance.
Very good. Yep, look at this. It was an inspiration, Mike. Mission accomplished.
All we need is one convert.
Right? That makes the whole 2 hours and 15 minutes worthwhile.
I can't believe that, that it's been 2 hours. But, someone once said the most interesting conversation that you can have is when you talk about yourself. So,
well, I mean, I've remained interested, and
yeah.
I don't know. I don't think I have any issues with ADHD or any of those other acronyms. But I mean, I also enjoy operations, and I think what you've done is very interesting. And someone was mentioning earlier, you were talking about the guy whose only response was it was very prototypical.
Yeah.
And a comment came in from Kent S. He says, maybe he was thinking this is too much like work. And I understand that sentiment. And, maybe for some operators that don't enjoy that level of detail, it might feel kind of like work. But I think you've done it just to the right level where it's not so much like work. Of course, I also don't work on a railroad, so I can't, I know a guy who does, real railroading, and he won't do op sessions because it's like, I do that when I'm working. What do I want to go someplace else and do it for, and I totally understand. That's like, I used to be a house painter, and people would call me up and say, I'm painting my house this weekend. Would you help? I'm like, hell no, I don't want to work on the weekend, So I understand that. But for someone who's into operations, I guess more casually, if you want to call it that, I think it's perfect. I would love to come out there, and who knows, maybe someday I'll have an opportunity to be in your area. I was just talking with Cliff, that was the clinics guy for the SIG meet. And he brought up this idea of, hey, why haven't you been to Chicago yet? Asking me that question because I haven't been to Chicago. And he's like, there's trains galore out in that area. Like we should go to Chicago. And I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll go to Chicago sometime with Cliff. And if I do, Minnesota's kind of on the way back, but not not really, but it could be made as an excursion. So who knows?
Who knows?
And we both know you. So that would be an excuse to.
That's correct. And, and there's all kinds of railroads in town. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, something to think about anyway.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't see a lot more questions coming in. So we'll bring this thing to a close. I really want to thank you, Mike, for taking the time to do this, because one of the things I really love to focus on doing these videos is finding stuff that is interesting enough to get people to do something that maybe they haven't done before, try something they haven't tried before. Well, I mean, it's that word again, inspiration, getting inspired to do something. And I feel like what you've done with your layout and going through, to that level of research and everything I find it inspirational, because I can nerd out a little bit on on operations like that.
Mm.
And as we saw from Joey, that's Late Night Model Railroad that was commenting.
Oh.
We got at least one convert, so it was worth it. And thank you very much for that.
Yeah. No, I like I said, I've been watching your show now, and I just can't believe that I'm here, following people like Jack Burgess and Seth Newman and Tony Thompson and even Jim Prozadenza, and it's just amazing to me that out here in Minnesota in this little 12x20 railroad that that I'm here.
I think it is I think it's a testament to what you've done. I mean, all the people you just mentioned, well, except for Jack Burgess, I think all the people you just mentioned have come to operate on your layout and had a great time. So, yeah. I mean, Seth had such a great time. He thought of you for doing the presentation at the SIGMate.
We're going to have to blame
Seth.
Yeah, we'll have to blame Seth for all this.
Yeah. I feel really lucky to live in this area where all the people you just mentioned are. I've gotten to know all of them, some much better than others. And it's just the model railroading community in the Bay Area where I live is just really, it's a vibrant community. And I can say without any hesitation that I have not met anybody in the community that's not willing to share their information or, any of their top secret tricks or anything like that. It's just like a great community. So I feel very fortunate to be doing what I do in the area where I live, because there's just a lot of great people out here. And I can tell from your podcast that Tom does, that you're on, that you guys seem to have a similar community where you live. And I think it's just great.
We do.
I need to figure out a way to be able to listen to that Crossing Gate more often. I've listened to a few of them and I did enjoy them. My problem is I don't have a lot of time, and I don't have the way my phone works. It doesn't connect to the Bluetooth in my car, because my car is old enough that it doesn't. Right. But the stupid phone doesn't have a jack either that I can plug it into the system in the car. So I'm kind of, I need to run a GoFundMe so I can buy a car that has a Bluetooth connection to the phone so that I can listen to podcasts.
Yeah. Well, that's funny that one of the local guys, we were chatting and he says, "Oh, I really like listening to the podcast." And he says, "I save him for when he's commuting." Mm-hmm. And he says, the problem is listening to the podcast, I want to interject during the podcast my thoughts. And he says, then he realizes that, it's recorded and he can't,
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how often you guys do topics that aren't, what's on your workbench topics, but if you guys ever want another voice, give me a call, because I'd love to hang out with you on your podcast and BS with some guys in another part of the country. It's going to be the same thing, probably talking about a lot of other things as well. But it's fun.
It is.
So anyway, one last comment and then we'll sign this thing off. Kent says, great for meeting people that you might not otherwise be able to meet in real life. And that's what this is about, Kent.
Yep.
So thank you for watching as well. So thanks, Mike. And
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. You're welcome back anytime. If you come up with another rabbit hole you want to discuss, you're welcome back. I do want to thank also our moderators in the text chat. They tend to keep things on track. And of course, our top secret producer, who's just off camera to my left here, who helps by finding links and posting links and bringing up some of the comments and questions that we have. Oh, there she is. And she's saying just what I'm thinking. Everybody have a good Memorial Day, and that'll do it for us here today. And if I could just find my closing credits. If you want to hang out for a second, Mike, until the closing credits are done, we'll be back on. And this is great. Thank you so much.
Sure.